को जाऊंगी। तो वो थोड़ी दूर जानी थी, तो मिस्टर लाइटनर ने कहा कि नर्स को ले जाओ। तो नर्स ने कहा हाँ मैं तो चलूँगी। तो मिसेस लाइटनर बोली नहीं नहीं नहीं, मैं अकेला जाना चाहती। तो सबको अटपटा लगा कि मिसेस लाइटनर ऐसा क्यों कह रही हैं, कि क्या हुआ मामा कि शाम को मिसेस लाइटनर क्या तुम चलना चाहोगी। तो आई थिंक मिसेस लाइटनर को लगा कि इसको बुरा ना लगे, ठीक है ना। सो फिर क्या हुआ कि ठीक है, उसने कहा कि चलते हैं। It was a lovely evening, a path between her barley fields and then through some flowering fruit trees. Finally we came to the edge of the Tigris. अब ये टिग्रिस नदी के पास आ गए। Immediately on our left was the tell with the workmen singing in their queer monotonous chant. वहाँ पे वो उस तरीके से queer तरीके से गाते हैं ना अरब्स। A little to our right was a big water wheel which made a queer groaning noise. I used to set my teeth on the edge at first, but in the end I got fond of it and it was a queer soothing effect on me. Beyond the water wheel was the village from which most of the workmen came. So the water wheel था village उस तरफ थी. It's rather beautiful, isn't it? Said Mrs. Leitner. It's very peaceful, I said. It seems funny to me that so far away from everywhere. भाई इतनी दूर है दूसरी जगह से तो इतना cool है. Far from everywhere, repeated Miss Leitner. Yes, here at least one might expect to be safe. मिसेज लाइडनर को शक था कि कोई उनको वहां मार सकता है, यहाँ पे सेफ रहेंगे। I glanced at her sharply, but I think she was speaking more to herself than to me. And I don't think she realized that her words had been revealing. We began to walk back to the house. Suddenly, Mrs. Leitner clutched my arm so violently that I nearly cried out. Who's that? What's he doing? Some little distance away of us, just where our path ran near the expedition house, a man was standing. He wore European clothes and he seemed to be standing on tiptoe and trying to look in at one of the windows. मतलब वो windows की तरफ वो देख रहा था. As we watched, he glanced around, caught sight of us, and immediately continued on the path towards us. I felt Mrs. Leitner's clutch tighten. Nurse, she whispered, Nurse. It's all right, my dear, it's all right, I said reassuringly. The man came along and postured. It was an Iraqi, and as soon as she saw him near to, Mrs. Leitner relaxed with a sigh. एक इराकी आया, उसने खिड़की में से उनके घर के अंदर देखा और फिर वो चला गया. He's only an Iraqi after all, she said. We went on our way and I glanced up at the windows as I passed. Not only were they barred, but they were too high from the ground to permit anyone seeing it. For the level of the ground was lower here than the outside of the courtyard. It must have been just curiosity, I said. जैसे curiosity में अंदर देखा होगा. Mrs. Leitner nodded. That's all. But for 1 minute I thought. She broke off. I thought to myself, you thought what? That's what I'd like to know. What do you think? But I knew one thing now, that Mrs. Leitner was afraid of a definite flesh and blood person. वह Mrs. Leitner को ये डर था कि कोई अब night alarm chapter 8 night alarm. It's a little difficult to know exactly what to note in the week that followed my arrival at Tel Yarimja. Looking back as I do from my standpoint of knowledge, I can see a good many little signs and indications that I was quite blind to at that time. To tell the story properly, however, I think I ought to try and recapture the point of view that I held, puzzled, uneasy, and increasingly conscious of something wrong. For one thing was certain, that curious sense of strain and constraint was not imagined. It was genuine. Even Bill Coleman, the insensitive, commented upon it. But strain tha, matlab, you know. It was David Emmett to whom he spoke, another assistant. I'd taken a rather fancy to Mr. Emmett. His taciturn was not, I felt sure, unfriendly. There was something about him that seemed very steadfast and reassuring in an atmosphere where one was uncertain what anyone was thinking or feeling. तो मतलब उसको डेविड एमर्ट जो था बहुत अच्छा लगा. उसका एक बिहेवियर था, मतलब स्टेडफास्ट सा नेचर था, बड़ा रीअश्योरिंग था, क्योंकि वहाँ पे दूसरे का उसका पता नहीं लग रहा था. No, he said, an answer to Mr. Coleman. It wasn't like this last year. पिछले साल ऐसा नहीं था. इस साल कुछ टेंशन है. But he didn't enlarge on the theme or say anymore. What I can't work out is what it's all about, said Mr. Coleman in an aggrieved voice. The बात क्या है? इतना टेंशन क्यों है? Emmott shrugged his shoulders, but he didn't answer. I had a very enlightening conversation with Miss Johnson. I liked her very much. She was capable, practical, and intelligent. She had, it was quite obvious, a distinct hero worship for Dr. Laidner. मिसेस जॉनसन जो थी वो डॉक्टर लाइडनर को बहुत पसंद करती थी. On this occasion, she told me the story of his life since his young days. She knew every sight he had done and the results of the day. I would almost dare swear she could quote from every lecture he had ever delivered. She considered him, she told me, quite the finest field archaeologist living. And he's so simple, so completely unworldly, he doesn't know the meaning of the word conceit. Only a really great man can be so simple. मतलब मिसेस जॉनसन जो थी पूजा सी करती थी कि भैया बहुत महान आदमी है, ठीक है ना, और इतना महान आदमी ही जो है वो इतना सिंपल हो सकता है. That's true enough, I said. Big people don't need to throw their weight about. And he's so light-hearted too. I can't tell you what fun we used to have, he and Richard Carey and I, the first years we were out here. और बहुत light-hearted भी हैं. जब पहले हम लोग आते थे तब बहुत मज़ा आता था. We were such a happy party. Richard Carey worked with him in Palestine, of course. Theirs is a friendship of 10 years or so. Oh well, I've known him for 7. 7 साल से मैं डॉक्टर लाइडनर को जान रही हूँ. रिचर्ड कैरी जो था 10 years से जानता हूँ. बड़ा मज़ा आता था जब वो आते थे. What a handsome man Mr. Carey is, I said. Yes, I suppose he is. She said it rather curtly, but he's just a little bit quiet, don't you think? Richard Carey थोड़ा quiet है. पता नहीं क्या बात है. He used to be like that, said Mrs. Johnson quickly. It's only since. Richard Carey ऐसा नहीं था जब से कि she stopped abruptly. Only since I prompted. Oh well, Mrs. Johnson gave a characteristic motion of her shoulders. A good many things are changed nowadays. बहुत सारी चीज़ें जो हैं बदल गई हैं. I didn't answer. I hoped she would go on, and she did, prefacing her remarks with a little laugh as though to detract from their importance. I'm afraid I'm a rather conservative old fogey. I sometimes think that if an archaeologist's wife isn't really interested, it would be wiser for her not to accompany the expedition. It often leads to friction. मतलब ये है कि आर्कियोलॉजिस्ट की वाइफ अगर इंटरेस्टेड है तो एक्सपेडिशन में क्यों आई है, मतलब उसमें फ्रिक्शन आता है. Mrs. Mercado, I suggested. Oh, ha! Miss Johnson brushed the suggestion aside. I was really thinking of Mrs. Lydna. She's a very charming woman. One can quite understand why Dr. Lydna fell for her, to use a slang term. But I can't help feeling she's out of place here. It unsettles things. मतलब वो आउट ऑफ प्लेस है मिसेस लाइडना. उसका ये कहना था मिसेस जॉनसन का, है ना, तो उसका ये कहना था कि ये एकदम कम्प्लीटली आउट ऑफ प्लेस है. So Miss Johnson agreed with Mrs. Kelsey that it was Mrs. Lina who was responsible for the strained atmosphere. मतलब मिसेस जॉनसन का ये कहना था कि ये मिसेस लाइडनर के कारण जो एक स्ट्रेन आ गया. But then where did Mrs. Lydner's own nervous fears come in? Mrs. Lydner इतना क्यों डर रही है? It unsettles him, said Miss Johnson earnestly. Of course I'm well. I'm like a faithful but jealous old dog. Mind ought to like him so worn out and worried. मतलब ये है कि मिस्टर डॉक्टर लाइडनर जो है थके हुए हैं और worried है, ठीक है ना. His whole mind ought to be on the work, not taken up with his wife and her silly fears. मतलब मिस्टर डॉक्टर लाइडनर का काम जो है का मन जो है उनके काम पे लगना चाहिए, नहीं तो उनकी बीवी के चक्कर में जो है पड़े हुए हैं. If she is nervous of coming out of the way places, she ought to have stayed in America. मिसेस लाइडनर को अमेरिका में रहना चाहिए था अगर आउट ऑफ द वे प्लेस नहीं आया था. I have no patience with people who come to a place and do nothing but grouse about it. मतलब आप इधर आए हो, अब आप क्रिप क्यों कर रहे हो इतना, बस उसका ये पॉइंट था. And then a little fearful of having said more than she meant to say, she went on. Of course I admire her very much. She's a lovely woman and she's got a great charm of manner when she chooses. And then the subject dropped. अब अच्छी लव चार्मिंग है, पर इधर आए क्यों, ठीक है. हम अब 2 मिनट और पढ़ेंगे. I thought to myself, it was always the same way. Wherever women are cooped together, and there is bound to be jealousy. Miss Johnson clearly didn't like her chief's wife. That was perhaps natural. Unless I was much mistaken, Miss Mercado fairly hated her. Another person who didn't like Mrs. Lydna was Sheila Rayleigh. She came out once or twice to the dig. Once in a car, twice with some young man on a horse, on two horses, I mean, of course. It was at the back of mind she had a weakness for the silent young American. Sheila Rayleigh ko jo tha, this thing. Emmett. When he was out on duty at the deck, she used to stay talking to him, and I thought too that he admired her. Emmett भी जो था शीला को पसंद करता था और शीला भी शायद उसको पसंद करती है. One day, rather injudiciously, I thought Mrs. Lydna commented upon it at lunch. The Rayleigh girl is still hunting David down, she said with a little laugh. Poor David, she chases you up on the dig even. How foolish girls are. David के पीछे जो है वो शीला जाती है. ठीक है ना? Mr. Emmett didn't answer, but under his tan, his face got rather red. He raised his eyes and looked right into hers with a very curious expression, a straight, steady glance with something of a challenge in it. She smiled very faintly and looked away. Emmett ने ऐसे challenge करके उसे देखा तो smile देखा. I heard Father Levigny murmur something, but when I said pardon, he merely shook his head and did not repeat his remark. That afternoon, Mr. Coleman said to me, matter of fact, I didn't like Mrs. L. any too much at first. She used to jump down at my throat every time I opened my mouth. But I began to understand her better now. She's one of the kindest women I've ever met. You find yourself telling her all the foolish scrapes you got her before you know where you are. ठीक है ना?